right. Well, thank you for joining us for this distinguished education panel. As you've heard from earlier panels, we're going to skip over the bios and jump right into the conversation. If you were able to attend some of our earlier sessions, you've heard about some of the really exciting school choice and education freedom victories that have been happening over the past few years. I'm really thrilled to have this panel here, people who've been working on these issues for a long time and on the front lines of the national debate today. I'll start with you, Corey. You describe yourself, I think, as a school choice evangelist.
I actually got that from a left-leaning group that labeled me, and I just took it over and said, okay, I'll take it.
Well, I like to think of you almost as the Paul Revere of the education choice movement, because if there's a debate happening, you and your legions of Twitter followers are leading the way out around the country. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where we've been, what's happened, and what can we take from it moving forward.
So that's a new one. I should update my bio. Maybe I'll put that on my Twitter bio too. The Paul Revere, haven't heard that one yet, so thank you. Maybe I'll put it on the next book coming out May 15th, 2024, The Parent Revolution. But look, it's a good question, and some people have different answers, but I think the overwhelming narrative is that we should really thank Randy Weingarten and the teachers unions for overplaying their hand, pushing to keep the schools closed, even though she basically lied in front of the Congress saying that they were fighting to reopen schools since April of 2020. Thankfully, she was hit with a community note fact check on X, formerly Twitter, for lying to all of us because she threatened safety strikes in 2020, called the president's plan to reopen schools reckless, callous, and cruel, lobbied the CDC to make it more difficult to reopen schools, had local affiliates deleting tweets saying that it was the push to reopen schools is rooted in sexism, racism, and misogyny, while their board members were vacationing in Puerto Rico. There was no problem with that, but they couldn't go back to work. But families got to see a little bit of what was going on in the classroom. It changed the argument for school choice. It was more than just test scores. It was about choosing a school that aligns with your values. And so the parents who were upset at school board meetings also pushed back at the ballot box and in state legislatures. And now we have 10 states now, a fifth of all states that have gone universal on school choice, meaning every single family, regardless of income, can now take their kids' education dollars to the private or public school of their choice.
And when you think of all those states, the estimate I've seen is 20 million kids or so could soon be eligible for having this widespread school choice. It's really an incredible time to see on the private school choice sector this immense freedom happening, particularly with ESAs and the widespread use of the dollars that are funded through these programs. At the same time, Nina, I'd be interested to hear your take. You've been leading the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. You've been a leading national education choice advocate for a long time, former Department of Education. What's your take on what's happened and what's happened at the same time for the charter school sector?
What's happened with ESAs and
just the national
landscape.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this past year was a banner year for charter schools. I know that ESAs get a lot of publicity, and Corey does a great job of publicizing those victories, but we had an equal number, if not more, victories in the charter landscape across the nation. The only difference is that charter schools have now been around for over 30 years, so it's not a new policy, but most states don't have a perfect law. So these changes are extremely important in terms of keeping the doors open to more schools, opening new schools, and keeping the regulatory burden on charter schools as low as possible. So we saw vast improvements in the charter law in states like Arkansas, where Governor Huckabee Sanders was able to make sweeping changes to its education programs and charter schools. Lifting the cap on where you can open charter schools was one of them. In states like New York, where they were trying to lift the cap on how many charters you can open, in New York City, they weren't able to lift the cap in New York, but they were able to make a change that makes it possible for those charter schools that have closed in New York City to transfer over to someone who's trying to open a new school. States like West Virginia, Idaho, Wyoming. So we have a laundry list of states, and we have a paper that's coming out that's going to list all these improvements. So the other thing I should just mention is during the pandemic, about 240,000 families opted for charter schools. And everyone thought this is just a blip on the map, it's going to go away. We did that survey again last year. The numbers stayed about the same. We're about to release it again, and we're pretty, you'll see what the numbers show. But people stayed in the schools they selected, or they stayed in the charter sector. So bottom line for us is, if we had more charter schools, more families would opt to send their kids to those schools, because these are schools of choice. And in most places, they meet the unique needs of the community in a way that, unfortunately, the district-run system is currently not meeting. We have 3.8 million students in charter schools now. 46 states have charter school laws, Montana being the latest one, and close to 8,000 charter schools around the country. So as far as I'm concerned, if you believe in public school choice, the best investment you can make is in charter schools.
I'm someone who has the view of all of the above. We want to be giving families more choices within the public sector to extend to the private and ESA side of the equation. Gavin, I'd love to hear your take as a former charter school leader. We have lots of openings for now for people to provide new schooling options with the growing parental demand, both in the charter sector and in the private choice sector. Could you speak to sort of the opportunity there, that based on your experience?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about charter schools, we're often talking about new schools opening, lowering barriers of entry for young entrepreneurs who have great ideas that might be challenging the orthodoxy. And we don't talk enough, I think, about bad charter schools closing. And that's really the beauty of the creative destruction in the free market, is that we have lots of ideas, right? Instead of just a single district orthodoxy, some of them are going to be excellent, and the ones that are not can go out of business. And that means that over time, right, because there's nothing intrinsically better about a charter school. It's the same kind of teachers, it's the same public regulation and apparatus, but the idea is that the bad performing ones can go away, and so you should see charter schools as a sector increase performance over time. In the same way, when the internet was new, there were like lots of hokey websites and so on. Now, top performing websites, right, like Google or Amazon, are excellent and dominating. And so I think what we're seeing also is top performing charter school networks replicating, which means that if you are just a parent who's not super informed and you're trying to take some school choice and send your kid to the neighborhood charter school, it's more likely to be a high performing school. And so as we're talking about more parents choosing charter schools, one of the reasons is that charter schools on average are outperforming district schools because the bad ones are dying and the good ones are replicating.
Shifting to the policy landscape, I'd be curious to hear each of your thoughts on what are the current debates. We've seen a lot of successes both on the private and public school choice front over the past year. Looking ahead to next year, where do you see the big opportunities? Where's the resistance for both sectors, starting with Corey?
Yeah, look, we've had 10 states go all in that have all been controlled by Republican legislatures in the past 2 years. Well, there are 22 states with GOP trifectas, so the next focus will be on those other 12 or so states that haven't gone universal, that are controlled by people who have a party platform that includes private school choice in it. And so one of the states, for example, is Texas. That's where I live. And for a long time, the Senate has gotten the ball across the finish line, passing school choice as recently as during the special session on an 18-13 vote with only one Republican defector in Texas. Then it's gone over to the House with a 60% majority of people with an R next to their name at least, and it's stalling there. We're in the middle of, I believe, another special session coming in Texas to get it done because Governor Abbott is a huge education freedom fighter. But the argument has been as to why they've blocked school choice, which the real reason is we have some so-called Republicans trying to have their cake and eat it too and vote against their party platform. But the argument goes that, well, we have rural areas in Texas, and because we have rural areas, that means, well, we don't have a lot of choices in Texas. We don't have private schools in Texas. They'll say, the quote, the public school is the only option. But in the next breath, with a straight face, they'll look you in the eye and they'll try to tell you, well, school choice is going to destroy and defund our fantastic rural public schools. Well, wait, which one is it? If you don't have any exit options, you should be the last person making the argument that this is going to defund your schools. And if they're so fantastic, like you say, you shouldn't have anything to fear about a little competition. And if you look at voters in rural areas, they're overwhelmingly supportive of school choice as well. In Texas, they put it on the ballot last year. 88% of Republican primary voters in Texas supported school choice. And that was the same whether you were looking at big counties or small counties. And if you look historically, West Virginia being the first state to go universal universal on school choice. They have rural areas too. They're more rural than in Texas, and they were able to get it done. The Texas Senate, they have the same geographic kind of boundaries. They cover rural areas, constituencies as well. They voted in favor of school choice. Look at the oldest voucher programs in the country in Maine and Vermont. They started in the late 1800s, and they were created because they had such rural areas. They were so rural, they didn't have public schools in some places, and this is still, the law is on the books today. They're called town tuitioning programs, and they'll give vouchers to families without public schools in the area to go to other public schools or to private or religious schools. So over 100 years ago, in Maine and Vermont, they found out that not having a lot of choice was an argument to expand opportunity as opposed to restricting it. Maybe places like Texas will start to figure it out today or pretty soon during the special session.
So the question was opportunities ahead.
Thinking about like the current landscape, what do you see as the next
Yes.
big debate, either in the charter sector or beyond?
Well, I mean, let me just emphasize how historic it is for what's happening in Texas. I started doing this work nearly 30 years ago, and I remember these issues in Texas, and the inability of rural Republicans to come together to support school choice was an issue. So the fact that the governor is bringing everyone back and forcing them to vote on this is definitely something. It's a moment in time that we should kind of pause and reflect on, and we'll see what he does with that. In terms of what's happening in the next few years, look, I think on our side, there is going to be a fiscal cliff. And that's the debate that all district schools are freaking out over what they're going to do after the money, all the three tranches of funding that came from the federal government, two of which were under President Trump, and the third came under President Biden, sent gobs of cash down to states and school districts for them to safely reopen schools, and a lot of them hired teachers, and they don't know what to do after the money goes away. So that's going to be a moment in time that we're bracing, and we've told all of our school leaders, you need to figure out a way to balance your budget and mitigate the risks of, whatever budget shortfall there may be. The other issue, and I'd love to hear Gavin and Corey's take on, is artificial intelligence and the speed with which technology is disrupting the jobs of tomorrow. So some of the conversations we're having right now in our school system seem, again, like things that happened 30 years ago, 20 years ago. These things are going to be totally obsolete after a while because, and you're in the tech space, so maybe you can answer this question. But for me, as my daughter just went to college, I'm paying a hefty tuition for her to get a fancy college degree, but I have no idea where to encourage her to focus on in terms of her studies, what the value of that college degree will be after she graduates in terms of the job that she's applying to. So as educators, charter school leaders, and Gavin is, someone who can speak to this, they're innovators, and they should be thinking about that next chapter far more aggressively and not be bogged down with some of the issues that everyone else is talking about. That's the opportunity to innovate, to figure out how you teach, how you replace a teacher that you might need to let go of and replace them with tools that can continue to teach your students, and at the same time figure out what it is that you need to equip your students with so that they are able to live a fulfilling life and again and enter the workplace. So to me, those are the bigger issues at play. And then, quite frankly, I mean, the data right now about how many families are homeschooling their kids, there was a piece in the Washington Post around that number went up pretty high according to the census, and I thought maybe that's just a blip on the map. Maybe the people taking the survey thought that just because the kid was at home getting schooled that they're being homeschooled, but it hasn't changed. So the fact that so many families are resorting and figuring out alternative approaches to educating their children is really one of the waves we should pay a lot of attention to. So to me, it's not so much about whether it's in the public, private, charter, magnet. It looks like there is a wave towards creating just these new things that are not in these traditional buckets.
Yeah, so two big questions on the table. One is AI, and the other is the next big debate in the ed movement. And actually, I think they're related. So for AI, when Google came out, everyone was freaking out and saying, is it even valuable to teach content knowledge anymore? Historical narratives, scientific laws, if you can just Google it, who cares? And they were right. It is much less important that you can name, the capitals of all 50 states today. What you really need is research skills. And I think with AI, that's going to even be more true. research skills, project-based learning, experiential learning, those are what's going to equip kids today to leverage AI as a tool to build whatever they dream of tomorrow. So I think schools that are rote memorization, lecture-based, and anything just focused on content knowledge are or should basically go out of business. I think those are not doing well by kids. And so the next big debate for education is who's going to be the most nimble in adapting to the new landscape, because those are the schools that are going to attract parents. And something that's, I think, we're at a politics and policy conference, and so we're thinking a lot about how from the top down do you solve the big issues. And that creates gridlock in politics because there's demonization, and it's almost impossible to get anything major done. The nice thing about the ed reform movement, and in particular charter schools, is that it's like a grassroots movement. It's ground-based up. So right now, maybe 10 cities in the country have majority market share to charter schools. And that's growing. And if it's not true right now, it's going to be true in the next couple of years when you do projections. So those cities have all the same unions, they have all the same pension systems, these special entrenched status quo interests, but they can't push back in the same way because half the parents in the city are enrolled in a charter school. And so they know the value there. And I think whether we like it or not, as long as there aren't caps on enrollment, and we like it, but obviously at other conferences in this city, people don't like it. As long as there aren't caps on enrollment, more and more parents will choose charter schools, and it'll be impossible to kind of stop or stem that growing political movement. So the nice thing here is that we don't have to care about the top-down. I mean, that's what you work on, top-down big federal programs, but the long-lasting effects of the ed reform movement are going to come from parent enrollment.
Turning on that politics issue you raised, I'm interested, Corey, if you could speak to some of what the road ahead looks like from expanding the current choice movement that's been thriving in the red states to the blue states and to the cities where these programs don't yet exist.
Yeah, you would think we'd have more private school choice in blue states if you look at what the voters want. The latest Real Clear Opinion research polling finding supermajority support among Republicans, Democrats, and independents. But the unfortunate thing is, in too many cases, the Democratic Party is owned by the teachers union. We mentioned Randy Weingarten earlier. Over 99% of her campaign contributions in 2022 went to the Democrats as opposed to Republicans or independents. And that's been like that for over 3 decades. Look at Open Secrets and their data over time since 1990, over 97% each election cycle going to Democrats. So in some cases, the teachers unions have become an arm of the Democratic Party, which makes it really difficult for Democrats who privately will tell you they support school choice and who support it for their own families, send their own kids to private school, including Stacey Davis Gates, the president of the Chicago Teachers Union, who just called school choice racist last year and called private school segregation academies, now sends her own kid to a private school. It's just total hypocrisy. But the way I think we get there, it's going to need to come from political pressure. And I've referred to it before as bipartisanship through hyperpartisanship. And it's more of a medium-term strategy, but the more that the Republicans win on the issue of parental rights and education, the more it becomes political suicide in some cases for Democrats to oppose it. And basically the idea is the more Terry McAuliffe's happen, where in Virginia, in a state that went 10 points to Biden the year before, Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, running against a former governor of the state, won on the issue of education by 6 points with education voters, which was the number 2 issue in that election. If you don't remember in the audience, Terry McAuliffe infamously said on the debate stage right before Election Day, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach, and even had Randy Weingarten stumping for him the night before the election. The next day on CNN, a Virginia mother actually said that was a nail in the coffin moment for her. So the more that happens, and I think that's kind of what unfolded in Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro, he's the governor of Pennsylvania now. He was up by double digits in the polls, and he was probably looking over to Virginia and saying, I don't want a Terry McAuliffe moment to happen to me. Right before the election, he put in private school choice, Lifeline scholarships into his education platform. And he ultimately caved to the teachers union this year. But he did go on Fox News promoting Lifeline scholarships this year. But he ended up vetoing his own campaign promise. We'll see how that works out for him. I don't think that was a smart move. It looks like he lied to his voters and caved to the unions. But my point is that the political winds are shifting. That he felt compelled to put that in his platform is good news, no matter what the reason. And in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, 3 weeks before the election in 2022, he's way up. He answered a candidate survey supporting the same program for low-income students in Illinois that he vowed to get rid of when he was running for governor in 2017, and he repeated in 2018. So the political winds are shifting. I think that's how we get there. Other ways to get there, federal school choice programs. There's the Educational Choice for Children Act. The new speaker, Mike Johnson, is a co-sponsor. I think there's about 130 co-sponsors in the House, and there's about 30 in the Senate. That could supercharge the existing efforts in red states, and it could also expand efforts to blue states without having government money following the child at the federal level. It's tax credit funded, it's private dollars. And then the third way hasn't been very successful in the past is putting it on the ballot. They tried this in California last year, didn't get enough signatures, but you can circumvent the legislators who are owned by the teachers unions by going straight to the voters in blue states, and maybe that's a fruitful endeavor. It hasn't been in the past, but maybe that's changed. It's very expensive, and but you might have a better shot doing it that way. And then, the fourth way is we live in a country with laboratories of democracy. We have 50 states. Maybe the more red state friendly competition happens at the state level, maybe some blue states will come along too.
On that issue of federal policy, I'd be interested to hear your take, Nina, on the regulations that the Biden administration put out for the charter sector and what could be done over the next 2 years with a possible flip of administration to make a more friendly environment for the sector, or more broadly. I know you have lots of thoughts on federal education policy.
Well, Dan, this issue that came up last year is kind of one of the dangers of centralizing power and authority in one place. And so we're big advocates of the federal charter schools program. It's a program that offers seed funding for anyone who's about to open a school. It also offers facilities finance to organizations that then back up the loan of a school that's going to purchase a building. There's also some national activities money. And it was a program that Bill Clinton signed into law and had the support of all presidents until, well, and this current president also includes funding for this program in his budget. With that said, the regulatory arm of the Department of Education decided last year to make some changes to the way this program was being distributed by adding preferences to who should get the money and what should be the purpose of the schools that are about to open should be, like one of which was to ensure that the schools were not further segregating their communities. Can you imagine if in most of the places where charter schools are opening, you're already in a segregated community. So in Washington, D.C., you can't then put the onus on the school to desegregate the community. There's something else going on. And so we made, the danger of having, again, regulatory issues are difficult to explain to the general public, even to your school leaders. Second, it's hard to hold someone accountable. You can hold the administration accountable, but with a law, you can hold a member accountable for doing something specific. In this case, not only was it a difficult thing to explain, at the end of the day, you're dealing with a federal agency. And so we were able to push back as much as possible. There are just provisions in there that we were able to address. More importantly, though, what this was intended to do was to dampen interest in applying and ultimately getting the money. And at the end of the day, the department, the way they rolled out the grant, the number of states that qualified and got the funds did not change, okay? But some of the provisions that they ended up including, which are in the form of priorities, hopefully I'm not confusing the audience here, right now there are no priorities for having, schools that are, desegregating their communities, for instance. But it's something that's considered an invitational priority. You can quickly change an invitational priority to a priority that has points attached to it. So those are the things that organizations like ours are looking at and watching very carefully. The other provision was to make sure that the communities in which you're creating charter schools are partnering with school districts, that the school district wants you to be in that community. I don't know of a lot of charter schools that are residing in a school district really wants them to be in that community, unfortunately. So those are the types of things that, again, you have an organization like ours that's watching over it, but it's very easy for another bureaucrat to step in and decide, well, let me add some additional points. By adding those additional points to the competition, you are in effect signaling to the state that in order to get this money, you need to make these changes to your statute. And that's what's dangerous, because charter schools laws vary depending on the state that they're in. Different organizations are ranking them based on whether they're, more libertarian versus more conservative when it comes to certain criteria. We like that. We think that these things ought to, have the flavor of the state, and that ultimately parents and lawmakers need to decide what kind of charter school law they need to have. But by having a federal incentive that's connected to priority points like that, you do risk to come up with one-size-fits-all solutions, which ultimately are not going to help the sector.
I just want to add on to that. So I used to run a network of charter schools, and we received one of these charter school program grants for about $750,000, and it was absolutely ridiculous. It was like the worst run program I'd ever been part of. The Department of Education had a terrible application process that made no sense. It seemed like they arbitrarily chose winners. Then actually through the process, you had to do like these ridiculous exercises that didn't, improve the management of the funds at all. There was no accountability. It was comical. I mean, except for that'd be very sad on the national scale. It was a ludicrous exercise to go through.
But you won.
We did win. I mean, I'm glad we got the money. As far as, and this is sort of how I feel about federal dollars towards charter schools. If the government's going to give dollars and try to bribe schools to look a certain way, which is this one, any way they do priority incentives, or they say you have to do this in order to get money, they're trying to enforce a one-size-fits-all approach. And the whole idea is that maybe Washington doesn't know the best way to educate kids, and we should let people on the ground figure out how to use dollars best. But if they're going to do that, I'd rather they devolve it to the states, people who are closer to kids. And I actually really think that I'd rather they don't do it at all, and that the way federal dollars could be used effectively is to bribe states to open up policies. So I think the best use of federal dollars in my lifetime was Race to the Top, which said if you want this education money, you have to enact certain charter school laws that make it possible for parents to have choice. And it's not that was perfect, but that was a transformative impact from federal funding. So, again, if we're going to dole out special interest dollars, the federal government, to anyone, I'd rather charter schools than elsewhere. But I'm not sure it's super effective. And I think those dollars could be better used by putting them in the hands of teachers and principals and people who know what kids actually need.
On that point, I'd love to get your opinion on.
Can I just answer?
sure,
You
sure.
want us to have it, but so first of all, this program is less than 0.1% of the total budget of the Department of Education. So it's by no means a lot of money, and because philanthropy has influenced how charters are growing, where they're growing, it is actually right now, despite this issue that happened last year, one of the only places where an individual who wants money to open their school can access money. And think about it. You don't have any funds coming to you unless you have enough kids and seats in your classroom. So without this kind of support, this little school in Alaska, Hawaii, these states that philanthropy has traditionally not focused on, has no chance to access money. So usually states get the money. If not, a nonprofit can get the money, and if not, an individual school can apply. What we do need to do, though, is continuously make sure that the burden on the person applying is low, and that they're not going through what he went through to apply for the grant. So despite the issue last year, I just want to emphasize how important it is for folks to appreciate this small federal program that's supporting charter schools. It's getting about $440 million a year right now, which is, again, it pales in comparison to some of the other programs that have lasted for so long and producing far less outcomes.
Sure. And when you mentioned $400 million federal program, earlier you spoke about the emergency money that was doled out during the pandemic. It's about $190 billion. And they've been slow to spend those funds, though they were supposed to help reopen schools and help with tutoring. We've been talking largely about charter schools and choice programs. I'd be curious if you all have thoughts about the tutoring sector and some of the micro-grant programs that have been established. Long ago, there was the Supplemental Education Services within No Child Left Behind. We're trying to get a few dollars to fund students for tutoring. Have you seen anything from that during the pandemic or in the state programs?
Yeah,
that have been created?
totally. I mean, you asked a little bit earlier about the future of education reform, and I didn't get a chance to respond as much as I'd like, but I think, yeah, there's been a mass exodus from the government school system already. I think the latest numbers I've seen is over a million students leaving district-run schools since before the pandemic, and there's been a lot of people going to charters, about 7% increase or whatever it was, and then nearly a doubling in homeschooling, and then private school has surged maybe 4%, according to what I saw at Washington Post the other day, if they're correct. But the microschooling sector has blossomed as well, and so much in places like Arizona where they have education savings accounts. They have this Prenda Microschools is one of their biggest operator. The Wall Street Journal actually put out a piece on this. I think it was the editorial board called "The Teachers Union's Tiny Little Enemy." There was actually an NEA, which is the largest labor union in the country. They have a federal charter, which makes no sense to me. We should get rid of that. But it's the largest teachers union in the country. The National Education Association, they put out an opposition research sheet on Prenda microschools because they see them as such a threat. And for people in the audience, microschools are basically miniature schools. 5 to 10 children basically usually get together in a household, and families can economize on the process of homeschooling. So it's kind of like homeschooling, small private school setting. This also helps us deal with the argument about rural areas not having a lot of brick and mortar private schools, is you don't have to start a new brick and mortar private school in a rural area if you have ESAs as opposed to vouchers. You don't have to pay for traditional brick and mortar private school tuition and fees. And so I think we're going to see even more of that expanding. And just imagine how many micro schools we'd have in the U.S. today, or how many kids would be enrolled with them if we had universal education savings accounts nationwide during the pandemic. Families were fleeing to micro schools. They were calling them pandemic pods, basically, at the time. And you had the New York Times, I think they were writing that it was causing segregation. And they were so close to getting to the solution. Well, give other parents the money so we can create more equal opportunities to go to micro schools too, expand education savings accounts. They couldn't bring themselves to doing that, but that was the obvious policy solution in my view. But I do think that's kind of the future here, because a lot of families are seeing the benefits of home-based education. And I don't know if charter schools are already embracing the micro school approach. But.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's everything you just said, 100% spot on. There are some charter applications for micro schools. They're very hip in the ed reform movement conversation. And I'm not sure, and I think the real approach here is that nobody on this panel knows the best way to educate kids. There's not a single answer, or if there is, it hasn't been discovered yet. And so what we should be doing or thinking about is, how do you put dollars in the hands of parents to make choices that make sense to them, and then create a regulatory environment that allows new ideas like micro schools. I don't know if that's the right way to do it. I'm not sure I'd send my own kid to a micro school, but lots of parents love them, and they seem to be doing well for some kids. And so let's run that experiment and see what happens. And if they are, then they'll grow and get more market share, which is more kids enrolled.
But to your question about the money, the COVID relief dollars, look, the only way to close the achievement gap that was enlarged during the pandemic, and it did grow bigger, and regardless of where you were, the gap grew. Charter school gaps also grew. The only way to fix this is by offering high intensive tutoring. And I don't know what school districts have spent the money on. Every conversation I've had in traditional district, run schools and settings is centered around how they need more time to spend the money. Yeah. So even though all the money has been made available, it seems like, they want more time. And again, so this is one of the functions of having centralized bureaucracies that are not functioning in a very efficient way at a time when you need to not only do what you were doing before well, but to also close the gap and do things much faster, which is unfortunate. But there are some proven tutoring programs out there, and the track record on SES, which I have PTSD from my days at the department working on that. I mean, that is, I still think if you give parents the option and you let the markets educate people about what works and what doesn't, parents are likely to make better decisions. But I don't know what sorts of studies are being done on how districts are using the money and how well those funds are closing the achievement gap.
We have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open it up to any questions from the audience. And if not, I'll keep going. Yes, sir.
Hey, Kyle Wingfield with the Georgia Public Policy Foundation. Curious what y'all think the future of accountability is. You know, we've had 20 plus years of different iterations of this, and it seems like a gradual erosion and waivers being granted and that sort of thing. Where that's going to go in the next few years.
Well, since I have the mic, I'll answer very quickly. Pendulum has definitely shifted, and I still think at the federal level, so long as you're spending the money, you should have some mechanism to see if the money is well spent. Whether the traditional ways of holding schools accountable, using test scores in the way that you were using AYP, and now letting states decide is the way to go is a question mark. But right now, certainly during COVID, all the tests were waived. I do think, again, some of it depends on what the presidential discussions are next year and what happens at the federal level. But I know that the civil rights movement and a lot of education reformers are intent on bringing some semblance of this back in service to the students being served. But at the same time, there are a lot of forces, and Corey can speak to this on the other end, that would prefer for this discussion to go away.
Yes, that was a good segue. But look, underperforming private and charter schools shut down. Underperforming government schools get more money. This was mentioned earlier. Parents have the best on-the-ground knowledge to make these decisions. And yeah, if we're going to have some form of top-down accountability, which is really just red tape and regulation, it shouldn't be based solely on test scores. Parents care a lot of things with their school. They care about it being a safe place, having a curriculum that's aligned with their values, and testing is only one part of that equation. So I think we should take a Hayekian approach and allow parents to make those on-the-ground informed decisions. As long as they're not, wasting the money on fraudulent activity or whatnot, it should be educational in its purpose. But there's a lot of unintended consequences of regulating these choices from the top down. And I think there have been some bills, and I'm thinking of Florida, they went universal on private school choice this year, but in the bill, they also had a provision to deregulate the public schools, and I think it might have been a deregulation on testing. And so that's one way to move forward to try to get buy-in from the public school sector as well, that, look, if families can vote with your feet, that's true accountability. You don't need to have the top-down regulation in the same way that you did before.
Yeah, I actually agree with that 100%. And I think that the role of the state government or even federal government should be similar to the role of the SEC. Like, they should make sure that charter schools or all schools aren't breaking the law, and they should make sure, like, companies have to do quarterly earning reports according to standard accounting practice. Charter schools and all schools should have to do the same thing, and there should be standardized ways in which they report maybe test scores and maybe social emotional learning data or parent satisfaction. The idea is let the information be transparent, and then make accountability a parent function.
So my question, not to make everything about Texas, but it's a big state. It could be really important. It sounded like Corey brought it up, and then Nina, it sounds like you have some insights. What's going on there? What's the lowdown? What's the misinformation? I'm based there. Free App's also based there, and I think we'd love to see a home victory. Yeah,
I live in San Antonio too, which reminds me that, look, we've had a lot of wins this past year, but my biggest win has been I got married this year. My wife's in the room as well. Woo! We also closed on a house last week, which is great. But look, yeah, we've been trying to get school choice done in Texas for a very long time, and you'd think a red state, Republicans control the legislature. They've had a GOP trifecta for 2 decades. They should be able to get it done. But the change agent here has been Greg Abbott. He's pushing it harder than he ever has before, and I'm seeing a parallel between Iowa from last couple of years and Texas this year. I don't know if you guys saw what unfolded in Iowa, but Governor Kim Reynolds was similarly pushing school choice as hard as possible last year. It was a limited program, a few thousand students, but it was still pretty substantial. It passed through their Senate with all but one Republican vote and voting in favor. And then with their 60% GOP-controlled House in Iowa, they couldn't get it done. She was holding the legislature past its 100th day, doing everything she could. They dug in, the so-called Republicans, and voted against their party platform. And she went out and played in the primaries, endorsed 9 candidates on school choice, and took out a ton of their incumbents who opposed school choice. And got a new House and vote. And Iowa then became the first state to go universal on school choice in 2023. And a lot of people joke in Iowa that the Democrats should have all voted for the limited program, because then they would have passed a smaller school choice program last year. Instead, they ended up getting full-throated school choice this year in January 2023. So I think That might unfold in Texas with Governor Abbott promising political consequences for his opponents. Ted Cruz also saying he's going to play heavy on school choice in the primaries. Dan Patrick's super supportive. He always has been as well. And so hopefully it doesn't come to that, though. We just finished the third special session in Texas. If you don't pass something during the regular session, the governor has the power to call something called a special session, bring everybody back to Austin to vote on the priorities again. The House never even voted on the floor for school choice or on school choice. So hopefully that happens if Abbott calls another special session, which all indications is that he's going to call another one. And if not, he has said, the money quote, we're going to get school choice. This is not a quote, it's a paraphrase, the easy way or the hard way. The easy way is you just come and vote for it. If not, well, you might have to get a new house like they did in Iowa last year. So. Yeah. We'll see what happens, but that's kind of what's happening. And I went over the rural ridiculous arguments earlier. It's just an excuse.
We have time for one more question, I think.
Okay.
I'm curious what you guys see as the big red herrings that are distracting from this debate. I know that in LA, they just had a vote where the inhabitants of Malibu no longer are sending their taxes to Santa Monica. So Santa Monica High School is like famously a really, really good public high school, like one of the best in the countries. So now with this vote, they're going to get a lot less money, and that's going to change. So I see that as a red herring. I see people voting on change housing to public school, that the housing taxes to public school pipeline, I see as having absolutely nothing to do with charter schools and school choice. I'm curious how the whole panel sees as like different red herrings that are thrown into this debate that have been hindering progress.
I'll start. Yeah, critical race theory in curriculum, banned books, all these like culture war things, that doesn't really affect what goes on in the classroom, right? There's already almost no accountability in district schools and not that much in charter schools for what teachers do. You can set board policies, like school board policies or state policies about anything. It's not actually going to change what teachers are teaching or what they're communicating to kids. So I think that's something that gets a ton of attention and doesn't actually matter that much on the ground. And I'm not, maybe that's my hot take here, but I would much prefer people to care about state policies like charter school caps or can funding follow the student to voucher schools. Like those are things that actually matter for parents. I also think like a lot of federal programs that fund specific, especially pandemic relief things, we had to spend a lot of money on thermoma guns, right? So like when kids come in, that was a total waste and it was just a gimmick. So I think a lot of these gimmick programs distract from what actually matters to kids.
Yeah, just a slight disagreement. I think these conversations aren't separate, right? So like a lot of families who want school choice, they may be concerned about a certain, it might be critical race theory, it might be gender ideology in the classroom, might not even be happening all that much, but if it is, families should have an exit option. And so like these parents showing up at school board meetings complaining about their curriculum, they're not just making stuff up, they're actually concerned about something, whatever that is, right? But I think we can all agree in this room that the better solution to whatever the curriculum disagreement problem is from the bottom up as opposed to the top down. So some people have been going to state legislatures saying, let's ban this concept, let's promote this concept, and have kind of force that ideology on the rest of everybody's kids. I think the better solution is we vote with our feet to schools that align with their values, whatever the reason may be. And if you want to choose a school with critical race theory or doesn't, that should be up to you, but you shouldn't tell other parents that they should not have that opportunity. So I think that's where everyone left and right should be able to agree.
Yeah, I think it's spot on.
Nina, do you want to offer any closing thoughts as we...
No, but I had a question for Corey in the few minutes left. Why is the governor so adamant about passing ESAs in Texas? And what lessons can that teach other governors in other places like Mr. Shapiro?
I mean, it's a political winner. You look at he campaigned on this issue against Beto O'Rourke, and Beto also went to private school, so he got to hit him on hypocrisy there. And Abbott won by a huge margin. Politicians respond to power, and in a lot of cases, but some of them listen to logic too. I'm not speaking about Abbott, but so that's part of it. It's also there's red state friendly competition going on in particular now, so that could have something to do with it. I don't know exactly why a particular governor would push for one policy over the other, but maybe they're also just listening to their voters. I mean, there's been a surge in support in Texas. UT Austin polling found between June of 2017 to June of 2023, 6 years later, they had a 18 percentage point increase in support for vouchers on the same pollster over time. The Republican primary voters going from 79 to 88% in just 4 years. So there's been a surge in momentum. So I think that's part of the reason. And then also just it becoming more of a GOP litmus test issue as well, with conservatives in particular becoming extremely supportive of school choice and seeing it as a solution to any of the curriculum disagreements they might have in the public schools. So that is a tough question. So you hit me with a tough one, but the reality is there's a lot of different reasons depending on who you're talking about.
With that, we have run out of time. I hope you will please join me in thanking our panelists. It was a great discussion.